Welcome to Tochii Studio, where we inspire, educate, and empower. This is Learn with Tochii, a space for bold ideas, practical skills, and purpose driven growth. If you're ready to lead with clarity and confidence, you're in the right place. Let's dive into today's topic. Today's topic is on API versioning. We're going to be discussing the different types of API versioning strategies alongside deprecation strategies and retirement. We're going to also delve into topics around the communication, the channels for communication, and how to retire APIs. Let's dive into it. API versioning allows developers to make changes, enhancements, or fixes to an API whilst maintaining compatibility for existing users. Whilst that might sound like it's just limited to these make changes, enhancements, and fixes, right? This concept is whenever a change that is going to affect the endpoint, the security method, or the API functionality in itself, we need to version that API. It means its functionality will not be as is anymore. And so the necessity for versioning becomes imperative to avoid breaking existing integrations. Common reasons for API versioning. Breaking changes include modifications to the API that could disrupt existing consumers, such as changes to data structure, endpoint, or authentication method. Another one is new features. So you're introducing functionalities or enhancements that may not be backward compatible. You can create a new version of your API. Or you're deprecating an old functionality, that is, you're removing or replacing outdated features without breaking user application. In these cases, you can version your API. There must be a process. And this is where versioning strategy comes into place. A versioning strategy must underscore how we manage the API versioning process. From selecting the version type to implementing the process and the eventual rollout, each of these processes needs to be streamlined. And then that deprecation process, which we're going to talk about in detail, needs to be well thought out and it needs a strategy around it. So, number one, you're choosing a versioning strategy. Number two, you're confirming the new version is necessary. If it's necessary, you update the documentation. Once you update the documentation, you gradually deploy the new version of the API, and at the end, you deprecate the old version. Now, let's talk about the different types of versioning. Number one, versioning through URI path. A URI is simply resource identifier. Now, I do recognize the URI is the family name for URL and URN. You have the URL, the universal resource locator, and the URN, which is the universal resource name. URNs are used when you're trying to find or when you're creating product IDs, products like books, where you have your ISBN number, barcodes, SKUs, in inventory management. Every commerce company has the URN concept. Whether it's a product ID, Amazon, I believe they have an ASIN. I believe that ASOS also has a product ID. If you take that ID and you put it on a website, what happens is that it will take you to exactly that product. That is the concept of a URN. Similar to the concept of a URL, it's a uniform resource locator. This is different because this one simply just enables you to sort of find websites because you're sort of hosted on a certain universal resource locator and you're not using IP addresses for the server. You have now updated it to use this uniform resource location. These are embedded within a URI. I'll explain the URI, URL, and URN. universal resource identifier, universal resource locator, universal resource name. And these are the use cases that are involved. Websites, commerce platforms for identifying a product. If you're enjoying what you've learned so far, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and tap that notification bell. That way, you would always catch new videos like this one. Let's keep going. We're making a change that is known as a breaking change. In order to complete that API versioning process, there is a process called API deprecation. The API deprecation is a process of phasing out old versions or features. This must be carefully handled to avoid impacting users who rely on the older version of the API. So a well-planned strategy needs to ensure a smooth transition without disrupting users. Now, let me explain one of the reasons why this is super important. In a use case scenario where a payment service provider is providing certain services to a bank via API, and you version that API, in a scenario where you do not pay attention to transitioning the older version of the API with that bank, or the bank doesn't adhere to the instructions that you have shared to the letter, what happens is that they use the older version, and should there be a case where you deprecate that API, the service will go down. Their users will not be able to use that service for, at the very least, until you bring that service back up. This is why API versioning is so important. There are three major reasons. One is breaking changes, as I've explained, modifications to the API that could disrupt users, changes to data structure, endpoint, or authentication. Secondly, new features, introducing functionalities that may not be backward compatible. iOS is compatible with iPhone 11, iPhone 12, iPhone 13. Everything below iPhone X is incompatible. Two things are not compatible in a new feature that cannot fit into that old structure. Deprecating old functionality is removing or replacing outdated features without immediately breaking user applications. What I'm going to do now is take you on a journey to explaining how API versioning should work. There must be a strategy around this. And the ideal strategy must underscore how you manage the process. From selecting a versioning type, there are 4 types, to the implementation process that is part of your API governance framework, the eventual rollout, and deprecation of the API. A few things to note. Choose your versioning strategy. Confirm the new version is necessary, breaking change, or compatible. If it's not any one of those reasons, then it should be compatible. Now, in a situation where it's a breaking change, you're changing a functionality, changing an endpoint, introducing a new feature, or changing the security authentication, whatever that might look like, if that's agreed upon, update the API documentation. The 4th step is that you gradually deploy the new version. Now, when you gradually deploy the new version, you do not deprecate immediately. There must be a phasing. I'll take you on that journey. I want to give you the 4 different types of API versioning. One is the true URI part. Now, when you version true URI part, this scenario is where the URI is updated to reflect a change has been made. Now, I did explain this earlier. There are 3 things when it comes to URIs. URI is actually a family name. URI means Universal Resource Identifier. There are 2 types of URIs. One is your Universal Resource Locator and Universal Resource Name. URL, this is popular because this is basically how your World Wide Web works and how you sort of find different web applications or web servers on the internet. However, for your URNs, they are different because they are used in commerce for inventory management like SKUs, UPNs, UPCs, product IDs. And like I said, in order to look at examples of URNs, simply check out the product ID. I think Amazon has theirs as SIN. Copy the product ID, paste that product ID on your web search. It will give you that exact product because that is a unique identifier for that product across the entire internet. This is what URLs are used for, and they're under one family called the URI. When you version through the URI part, you're essentially showing that there is an older version of this, and this is either version 1, version 2, version 3, and it simply tells the user that, well, there is a version before this. That is, if it is 1, then there's a V0. If it is 2, then there's a V1. There are a few pros and cons to this. This is one of the most popular versioning strategies. It's easy to understand and implement. It could simply be tochiiachebe.com/v1. That's as simple as it is. There's a clear separation between versions. That is, like I said earlier on, you have V1, you have V2, and so there's a clear distinct between V1 and V2. But then there are also cons. It requires changes to the URLs in client application. That is, the client cannot enter V0. They need to change that to V1 if they had V0 before. It can lead to API endpoint duplication. Secondly, versioning through query parameter. This is simple and popular. If you have used Postman or Swagger, using the query parameter is adding a key and value is as simple as you can name this as a key can be named anything, and the value is the description of what that key is. The key is Tochii, and this value is XYZ. Tochii represents XYZ. This versioning strategy says you can also say this as V1, V2, but the difference, it's only going to reflect in the query parameter. It's not on the URI part. A pro here is that it does not require URI structure changing because clearly it's not going to be on the URI. However, the con here is it's less intuitive because you cannot see it. You do not know, and it may also simply just cause confusion because it doesn't jump out. It can complicate caching mechanisms and API routing. The third point is versioning using header versioning. Header versioning is similar to query parameter because in this case, as opposed to using query params, you're using the headers. Again, key and value, whereby you can simply enter a key to say this is what it represents and the value is the description. The pros are it keeps your URL clean and version independent. It's useful when versioning must be invisible to users. The con is it is more difficult for developers to test without proper tooling. That is, developers will need Postman. It can be harder to discover and document for users. Another versioning strategy is content negotiation versioning. This specifies the version through the accept header using media types. I would use a call and a header to say accept application / whatever that endpoint is, add the versioning behind that. I know that sounds a bit complicated. That's why most people probably do not use this. One of the pros is it's clean. Its versioning is decoupled from the URI. It allows fine-grained control over the response format. But the cons are that it is harder to debug and test without special tools, and it may confuse users unfamiliar with this method, and that's why a lot of people do not really use this. Now, API deprecation phases, there are 4 phases. The first phase is the announcement. Why is this? You want to notify users that a new version or a specific feature of the API is being deprecated. You are trying to tell them, look guys, this old feature, it's coming to an end of life because we have provided you with a fresh set of features with a more formidable API. Or for whatever reason, you're closing out this API. So firstly, you need to notify users, communicate timelines and reasoning for deprecation, and you provide alternative solutions, ideally in your version. You need to provide detailed documentation and migration guides. Now, detailed documentation is essentially telling them this is what you need to do. This is how you need to make this change. This is how becomes optimal in your service. And that migration guide will help them through that process. So, what does failure look like? What does success look like? The process from point A to point B is clearly mapped out. The second phase of the deprecation process is a grace period. It allows a short or long term period, not necessarily dialogue, but enables the customer put this in their roadmap. So this allows a grace period during which the API version or feature would remain fully functional. The length of the grace period would always depend on the nature of the API. And I've explained so far that different types of APIs, dependent on their value, should be between 6 to 12 months. And so, dependent of the nature of the API and the criticality of the changes, you should typically just always want to phase it between that 6 to 12-month mark. The third phase is partial deprecation. After the grace period, start limiting access or reducing support for the deprecated API version. Consider rate limiting or logging warnings in API responses to notify users they are using deprecated features. The final phase is the full deprecation or the removal of the service. You're terminating all access to it, notifying your users well in advance, and you're providing clear migration paths to the new API version. And that's really as simple as it gets. But stakeholder communication is super important. Firstly, be clear in communication. So you want to use multiple channels to inform your user of upcoming deprecations, including emails, API response headers, your developer portal documentation. Include deprecation notices in API responses. So, for example, offer migration support. By offering migration support, you need to create detailed migration guides that simply enable the users to switch to newer versions of the API. So, outlining changes, new features, and required updates. Offer direct support, more like one-to-one support to say, can I have a chat with you, a 5 minute, 10-minute call with you to sort of support you from where you are currently based off of your roadmap as my partner to take you through this migration process. You need to always maintain backwards compatibility when it's possible. Really, in this process, the ideal thing to do when you're managing these processes is you need to avoid frequent breaking changes. Use minor versions or optional features to introduce non-breaking changes. Deprecation warnings in responses to implement warnings in HTTP headers or response bodies when a deprecated version is accessed. Now, that staggered deprecation timeline is another important factor, as I have also mentioned earlier, because semi-deprecation before full deprecation, it gives that grace period or the grace period in between, it gives that buffer. Now, finally, you need to respect SLAs. SLAs are simply your service level agreements. You need to ensure that the deprecation adhere to any service level agreements you have with your customers or partners. Another part of this process is clear notification. Embed this process, no matter how much value with this new API, embed this process within their roadmaps. It needs to be clear and early enough. Communication should start well before the new API version, especially if changes include breaking changes or deprecations. Now, the announcement of new versions, who should you announce this to? The developers, the partners, the internal teams. How? Emails, developer portals, forums, blogs, API response headers. And what are you announcing? You're announcing the upcoming version, highlighting the changes, that is the value proposition of this new version of the APIs, the improvements that have been made, any breaking changes. You would share the reasoning behind the new version. ideally 6 to 12 months before the new version is released. So 3 to 6 months before it is released, and once it is released, another 6 months. All in all, 12 months. So that one, you've included this from the start, and once you have implemented this change, the 6 months is where you have the grace period and all of that. They have been able to include it. Ideally, your customer should have included it in their roadmap in the first phase, so that by the second phase, all we are talking about is the migration guides. Now, we move on to deprecation announcements. Who should you announce the deprecation to? Ideally, your developers, business partners, or internal teams. How should you do this? Use the same channels to announce the new version. Email alerts, API alerts, but you must also have direct communication with these stakeholders. You're providing a detailed deprecation plan, explaining which features are being deprecated, the timeline, and how stakeholders should proceed. You're simply speaking about user guides or migration guides, especially for critical or major changes. Now, to speak again about the communication channels, like I did say earlier on, most should be existing channels, like your developer portal, your API response headers, your email campaigns, your community engagement, that is your developer community, communication with strategic partners, that is your key partners, you need to communicate with them. Now, version specific documentation needs to be clear and detailed for each version of the APIs, including endpoint and usage, detailed description of new features and changes, examples of deprecated and removed functionalities. Another point is your migration guides. Your migration guides must offer comprehensive migration guides that explain how they transition from the old version to the new one, that details key changes in the API schema, endpoints, and parameters, how to update client code to accommodate the new version, changes in authentication or security protocols. In your change log, publish a detailed change log that outlines all the updates, bugs, fixes, breaking changes, that makes it simple to the developers to basically track modifications that have been made between versions of your API. When we speak about deprecation timelines and the support, so you have the grace periods, you have the support during transition periods. Now, the grace periods, like I did say earlier on, it's something whereby you're sort of prepping your customers, communicating the timeline. You're saying this old version is coming to a close. You're ensuring a reasonable grace period of 6 to 12 months for users to transition to the new version. You must support during transition, right? So you must offer things like webinars for the group, training sessions to explain the new version, access to your sandbox environment to test the new APIs, technical support, whether through your channels, Slack, Teams, help desk, email support, any support or channel to communicate with customers effectively or partners. Each of these customer groups need to be communicated in different ways. For example, developers, business, and internal teams. For developers, focus on the technical aspect of the versioning, explaining the benefits, for example, the new changes, performance improvements, potential impacts, right, of these APIs. You want to, for business partners, emphasize how the new version supports their goals, such as things like improved integration, better performance of their system, enhanced security, things of that nature. Ensure alignment between the product management, marketing, and support teams. Provide internal training so everyone understands the changes and can communicate them effectively. There must always be a continuous update and feedback loop. Manage stakeholders. Provide consistent updates throughout the deprecation and migration process. That is, your stakeholders informed of the progress. So any upcoming deadline needs to be communicated. Any potential changes to the timeline needs to be communicated. The feedback channel is to encourage feedback from your partners, developers regarding the new version and migration process. Use this version to improve the versioning strategy and refine the versioning strategy over time to improve the user experience. Now, that post migration follow up, the idea really is that after the old version is deprecated, follow up with your stakeholders to ensure that the transition that you have gone through has gone smoothly. You want to address residual issues and collect feedback for future efforts. Communication plan for API versioning includes the milestone, audience, comms channel, message, and timeline. The timeline should be 6 to 12 months. The first path should be before the new API version is released. And the second is more so like the grace period whereby you are managing this entire migration process. Now, so the first step is your versioning announcement in the first 6 months, extending to all partners through various communication channels. The second is your deprecation warning, at least 6 to 12 months before deprecation. To your external developers, different partners, through developer portals, emails, community forums. This would be a step-by-step guide to upgrading V1 to V2 and the necessary changes to integrations. This should happen 6 months before deprecation. Now, when it comes to the deprecation, in the next 6 months, remind them of the deprecation date, communicate through emails, API headers, response headers, and it's more like a reminder to tell them this API version is going to be deprecated in the next 4 or 5 months. Ensure your application is updated before the V2 deadline. And this is ideally at least 3 to 6 months before deprecation. Have the final deprecation notice 1 to 2 months before deprecation. You have the post deprecation follow up, speaking to everyone, and this message is now hope the transmission was smooth. If you need any assistance, you need to contact support. This would happen after deprecation has been completed. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more API and product insights. Comment one topic you would like me to teach on next. This is Tochii, here to inspire, educate, and empower. See you in the next video. Cheers.